I have to say that I don't usually use slides, but I think it's a requirement for this symposium. So usually I like to kind of give a talk and conversation and this type of thing, but I think I've managed with some help. So I think I'm probably bringing something a bit different to this symposium, because I'm not an academic. I'm not employed by any university at all. I'm not in a professional practice at all. I'm not bringing any professional experience to this at all. I'm a community activist. That's where I come from. I'm active with community groups and have been for most of my life. So the perspective that I'd like to give is, how do we move from the good intentions of working with communities and community groups and put this into a practice, making it really happen, and what can that look like? And really the theme of what I'm going to present is, if we want to challenge spatial inequality, if we want to challenge injustice, then the people who are experiencing the inequality and the injustice have to be at the centre. At the centre. They have to be equal. They have to have agency, as I would call it, if you understand me. And this is different to the citizen, the community, being invited by an institution into a space that is controlled by the institution. I think this is it's a very different way of looking at it. But from my perspective, having the community at the heart and in the lead is actually the only way, if we are serious about addressing inequality and injustice. So this is really my overview, my theme. In terms of the organisation that I'm representing here, which is called Just Space, this is a network of community groups. It's London-wide, so it's city-wide. It's not a neighbourhood group. It's not a local project. It's a network across a very large city of many different community groups. And by community groups, we don't mean public sector. We don't mean voluntary sector. What we mean by it is people who have come together in their own free time because they want to do something, they want to change something. So they don't employ staff. They don't usually have any kind of office or headquarters because they don't have the funds for that kind of thing, and it doesn't fit with what they're trying to do, because they are genuinely a voluntary association. So this character is very important for our work. And we think it's that the whole notion of community is so contested, because community can mean everybody, can't it? We're all community, we're all citizens. But in this context, what I'm describing is the kinds of community groups that I've mentioned, which includes tenants and residents associations. It includes friends of parks, of which there's many in London. It includes community centres and those who are managing the space of the community centre. It includes what are called neighbourhood forums, which fits in a bit with what Carolyn said around this localism in England. And yes, and I should mention, very important as well, that it includes a number of equality groups, so groups of people who specifically organise around disability or ethnicity or age and so on. This is also an important part of the community groups within our network. We were formed in 2006, so we're not a new organisation, 12 years. And the moment in time that led to Just Space starting is very important for our story. Within the English planning system, we have a requirement that if a plan is being produced, then there has to be something called an examination in public examination, public hearings, if you like. This is a legal requirement. And this is facilitated by an independent panel. So it's quite different to the local state kind of consulting with you and then putting on a public meeting with you. It's very different to that. Something that's where you are called by an independent panel. And what led to the formation of Just Space was that one of these examinations in public was about to happen in London, and some of the groups who wanted to take part and had made written comments suddenly thought, why don't we get together, because we're going to be attending these public hearings, and our past experience has been that we've been quite isolated and few in number, and developers and public authorities have dominated. Maybe in the same way that they organise themselves, we as community groups, perhaps we ought to start organising a bit here and not just turn up and have our say. So this was the origin of Just Space. So it was groups with experience and knowledge who were already participating, but participating as their own group, and seeing the need and the benefit of coming together in a network in order to challenge the domination by public and private interests. This was the origin and start. So I think there's something special here in terms of what's been said previously. This is not at all a question of an institution seeking out people in the population who are interested and giving them support and advice. This is a completely different story. This is around community organisations who've organised things on their own and have decided at a point in time we need to make this citywide in order to be more effective in the future of the city. So this was the origin of Just Space. And as the final bullet point shows, we are citywide, but of course planning and other policies don't just keep within a city boundary. These work at many different scales. So we've always worked at a local level, we've worked at a local authority level, as well as a city level. And though this isn't on this bullet point, we're increasingly looking at making connections outside of London. But they need to be real connections and not only attending nice conferences like this, but things that can be much more sustainable. And that's become increasingly important for us, and I might have time to explain why a bit later. Just briefly on this one, what it is not. We always have to emphasise we're not an NGO, because people often assume we are, or that somehow we fit into this term NGO. People like to say they work with NGOs when they're trying to say we work with the community. And for us, I'm sorry if some of you find this a difficult idea, but we in Just Space find NGOs a problem, generally. Not all of them. We work with some very nicely, but the majority of NGOs we think are a problem for what we are trying to achieve. Because for us, they are compromised. They're compromised because of their funding sources, because of their political relationships, because at the end of the day, they are usually an advocacy organisation. They're not a direct voice. And in our opinion, it is the direct voice of the citizens that is essential for any transformation. And those who are not directly experiencing whatever their intentions actually are not the best people to drive transformation. So this is an important issue for us, that we are quite different to an NGO. And maybe the other things on the slide we'll come back to, because I'm going to use too much time otherwise. Just briefly on this one, we have produced a number of publications, and one of them is this one, Towards a Community-Led Plan for London. Now, I'm not going to say too much on this today, but just to show you all that within Just Space and this community network, we are not just reacting, we are not just responding to what other people produce and then, giving our ideas, contesting it, and so on and so forth. We started off doing that, but then we quickly found that this was not very empowering to keep on reacting to what others produce. We need to be producers too, and we want to fight for a system which gives us the space to be producers. Otherwise, what does all this rhetoric about co-production mean? So 2 years ago, we produced our own community plan for London. This is not a radical story at all. In fact, we don't like the word radical either. We don't see ourselves as radical or revolutionary, because we think that is to actually marginalise ourselves within the debates that happen. We think we are completely mainstream. We are the, we are the voice from below, if you like. So, though to begin with, people wanted to call this, some people, an alternative plan, and it was mainly the more intellectual members of our network who were thinking of an alternative. Actually, when we started thinking about it more, we again felt an alternative is to suggest you are outside of something. Actually, we want to be we want to be the something, not to be always on the outside. So we quickly disposed of the idea of an alternative plan and called it a community-led plan instead. And just to say, this is not a critique. This is not in the main a narrative. This is a very practical set of propositions over about 80 pages, which we hope is also very integrated. So we are trying to actually integrate a whole range of policies which are important for the future of the city. And just to say that there is, of course, a big process to producing this, which maybe I can come on to another time, and that the input of students and the university were very important, because this brings me into the relationship with the university. Because, of course, with subjects like planning, they're very technical, and there's requirements for evidence. This is, we call it evidence-based. So for people who are volunteers, however passionate and experienced they are, there is a time issue here. And the universities, students are really invaluable in terms of helping us to put together our evidence base that the system requires. to support, to reinforce the policies that we're proposing. So right from the start of Just Space's story, we recognise the value of this support from the universities, and we've always worked with the universities. So this brings me on to the main section which I've been asked to talk about, which is how do we work with the universities? What's the relationship like? And this is really setting out a few ideas for you. The protocol, I've got a separate slide, so I'll come on to that. We in Just Space, we are running 2 master's courses at one of the universities, UCL. So this is not us being asked or invited necessarily. These courses are designed by Just Space, by the community network. One's around the whole question of community participation and city strategies, and the other one's around social inclusion in planning. And these are 2 master's modules that the community is actually deciding the agenda for. So we define the purpose and we define the outputs, because the outputs is critical for the community. We need to have confidence that there's going to be positive, useful outputs. Otherwise, why are we bothering, really? So this is established by the community, and then we're sitting down with the academic colleagues that we are working with, and Michael Edwards is one of them that you kindly mentioned. And we look at how to actually, turn this into practice in terms of the whole learning experience of the module, and how the assessment process will be able to respond flexibly to what we want to do and things like that. So it is co-designed in that sense, but it's responding to the community agenda very much. Community tutors, for these 2 modules and for 2 other modules, also master's modules, Just Space provides tutors for the modules, and the usual format is to have a couple of academic tutors and then a couple to community tutors. So the community tutors come through the Just Space network, are chosen by the Just Space network, and Just Space receives funding from the university, of course, for providing community tutors for these modules. So the funding source is important for us. But they're not, the community tutors are so called because they're not on the payroll of the university. They're not employees of the university or anything like that. And then there are a number of examples which I'll come to at the end of how we've done joint publications. And then the final point, we've worked a lot with one particular university in London, UCL, University College London. But that's not the only university in London we're working with. And just to give you an idea of this, we had an event over the summer where we were looking at, given that Just Space has produced a map of 250 community groups across London and what their needs are in terms of their relationship with professional practice. So this can be legal advice, it can be mapping support, it can be producing summaries of technical documents, and many, many other things. So around 250 groups were interviewed and their needs were mapped. And this is a huge question for the universities, because one university can't respond to such a huge amount of need. And of course, this is only part of the story. The need's much bigger than this. So we actually organised a meeting in London of representatives from 12 of London's universities, at which we presented the work of our Just Map, the needs of 250 community organisations. And we spent half a day starting a conversation about what the universities were doing at the moment in terms of their relationships with communities and how they could respond to this just space agenda in terms of the community need. So this was quite recently over the summer, and we're now looking at getting some grant applications through some of the universities to enable us to resource and support this quite complex piece of work, as you can imagine, of bringing together 12 universities. And I have to say, again, there's an irony here that these, what we see as very well-resourced institutions in London have never been able to get together on this themselves, despite some of the rhetoric around working with communities, and it takes a community organisation to bring them together. And this was commented on by the university members themselves, that how strange and peculiar this was, but maybe it's not so peculiar. You'll have to keep me to time. Tell me when I've got 5 minutes, okay? This slide is really just to say what may be obvious, that our main relationship with the universities is not with the Vice-Chancellor. You know, it's not really with the university as a corporate body. It's really around building relationships with interested individual academics. And then sometimes that grows and grows to the extent where we are, for example, making use of what are called public engagement units in some of the English universities. But the most important thing for us is the relationship building, just as that's how we build our own network, the relations between community groups. In terms of building our relationships with universities, it's with committed, interested academics. It's not trying to go to the corporate university and ask them, change what you do, please. You know, I think one requires a more bottom-up approach than that, really. And finally, on this main section on working with universities, just to let you know that we've produced a document which is on our website, called a protocol for collaborative research between community groups and academics. And we produced this written statement because a lot of community groups were having bad experiences from universities. By that I mean students usually, but sometimes academic staff as well, would come into a community. They'd want to do some research, they want to interview, and community groups generally would want to be helpful, but then they wouldn't see the people again. And because this was continuing, a lot of community groups at the Just Space meetings were complaining about the universities and saying this has to change. We can't just come and have all our knowledge is just being made used by the university, and we don't see anything at all. We don't even see how they use our knowledge. So this was what led to us producing what we called a protocol. And the starting point of it really was whenever the students or academics are interacting with the community, you must share the results of the research. It must be shared with the community groups, those you interviewed. That's the first essential point, really. It's the least that can be done. And it surprises me greatly that this isn't seen as an important practice. Certainly my experience in English universities is this isn't, for some reason, seen as an important thing to do. So that was really the first point of the protocol. But then, of course, it goes into other issues around how does one actually add something of benefit and value to the community that you're taking knowledge from? Are the things you can be helpful with? as a university in terms of some of the research needs of the community. Can you add that into the research that you're undertaking so that it's more of a shared relationship and not you just abstracting the knowledge and then producing something, but what's for the community? So, and there's a number of issues like this that we go into in the protocol, which again, I would have to return to another time for time reasons. And then, how long do you want me to carry on for? Okay. And then finally, just to apply this to some of the issues, because you might be wondering, okay, this is all process talk so far, or relationship talk, but what do you do as Just Space? You know, what are the... And really, it's not so different to what Tatiana was saying in her presentation around, you know, these are the big issues, because I agree with you completely. I mean, these are so common problems, you know, all over the world, really. And it's no different for us in London with Just Space. It's not anything peculiar generally, but I will maybe give a bit of nuance for some of them. To say at the outset, and this may be slightly different to the list that was given before, is that for Just Space, the most important issue is participation. That we have, as you can see here, many issues around the housing crisis, around economic and environmental crisis, community spaces, and so on. But our view is that unless there is a real participation within the society, then actually these things aren't going to fundamentally change. That we can keep proposing all we like and produce our own plans, but unless we actually, unless space is open for us within the system, then we're not really going to get many results. We'll get small things as we do, but the bigger changes, how can they be if actually we're not the decision makers at all? So this is always our central point, and it's the first chapter of our community-led plan. 3 quick examples to conclude with on some of the work that we do. This one might surprise some, but we do a lot of work on industrial workspace. So yes, London has had a lot of deindustrialization, of course, as with many cities. But as of now, we actually are experiencing a growth in the industrial sector. Of course, I don't mean by this traditional big manufacturing. It's much more around smaller industrial units. But of course, many of these are essential to our life. I mean, those who have a car, how do you get it repaired? Those of us who use a lift and it breaks down, where's the people who are going to come and repair it for us? You know, and so on and so on. All of these services are essential to the running of our town or city. And what's been happening in London is these services being displaced, being moved to the periphery of London, because of course we want to extract more value, you know, from this land. And what does that mean? If you're, to give my example, if your lift breaks down and you've got a contract with a company that's on the periphery of your city, for example, or outside the city, obviously it's going to take a lot longer to get that lift working again than if you've got a company to call on that's quite close to you. So there's many issues with this, and you'll see in the slide a few examples of some of the more detailed aspects to this. And we are working on this issue with some small business associations. We are working with academics and community groups too. And I should mention that because Just Space is a community network, as I defined it, academics, for example, can't be full members of the Just Space network, but we found in our economy work that there was a lot of academics in London who were really interested in a different kind of economics and applying that to issues like what's the future for small-scale industry in the city. And they wanted a forum where they could support each other in their academic work and be able to apply that. So that led us to set up a separate part of Just Space called the Just Space Economy and Planning Group, in which everyone was welcome as an equal contributor, that it wasn't just a community space, but it was a community space with small businesses, academic researchers on the question of fundamentally transforming the local economy. And you'll see on the left-hand side, there's an example of one of our publications, and the work on this was led by a PhD student who wanted her PhD to be on the question of local economy and participation, and she was able to get research grants as part of her PhD work to support the production of a publication and the interview work of the cases that were covered in this. So again, another example of how we make use of our relationship with the universities. The second of the three issues is around what we call traditional markets. So this is street markets, covered markets. In London, there's been very many of these historically, and these are also under pressure because, again, they're not seen as the most profitable way to use land and space. So many of them are under threat of closure or being moved, and yet they're essential in terms of affordable food, for example, to be able to buy things in an affordable way. Healthy options, you know, in terms of just getting your fruit and vegetable locally. I mean, you'll see in the slide, there's many good reasons why we should be supporting traditional markets. So again, we've been able to bring together groups from a number of London's markets, and these usually in London are a mix of the traders themselves working together with the users of the market and community groups from the surrounding area who value the market. So it's usually a local alliance, usually in London's context, not just a traders association. And we've done quite a bit of work over the years, for example, with mapping the street markets across London, because by mapping, of course, it gives a visibility, but it also encourages different groups across the city to come together who have a common issue. So mapping's been very useful. And then you'll see from the bottom bullet point that currently we're part of a national research project with another university outside London called Leeds University, who've got research grants to look at what's called the community value of a market. So traditionally, all the attention's been on how do you look at the economic value of the market, you know, in a wider sense, but not finding ways to really give the true value to the community side of it. So we're actually working in a project that's trying to actually look at both quantitative and qualitative indicators of community value as applied to your traditional street markets. And then the final example is around social housing, social tenants. You may have read that in London there's huge gentrification and lots of demolition, which is all true, but there is still a very substantial part of the housing stock in London that's social housing. It's quite different to here. It's still very substantial, but under pressure for the same reasons as the markets and the industrial space. And again, we've done a lot of work. It's one of our big areas of work. We've done a lot of work over the years, working with the tenants groups. So again, in the London context, and I think you can certainly apply this across England anyway, there's a strong tradition of social housing tenants or council tenants actually forming associations on the estates where they live. There's a very strong tradition of this. Certainly in the London context, we have the estate associations, thousands of them across London. They then come together at their local authority level in terms of a federation. And then there's a London Tenants Federation, which brings together the borough federations. So quite a complex structure, a federation of all the tenants associations across London. And we work a lot with them and have done from the outset. They were one of the founder members of Just Space. Again, we've done a publication, which was again done with a different university, just to show we're not only the one university. This was actually King's College London that we did this project with. We got research grants to, amongst other things, produce this handbook to encourage the tenants associations around different ways in which they could not just protest against proposed demolition, but successfully challenge it from early stages. So we set out in this handbook a lot of positive examples, ways in which you can get information, asking the right questions, and so on and so forth. And just finally to say that, because it's nice to give some successors, isn't it? That you'll see at the bottom it refers to Mayor's Good Practice Guide on Estate Regeneration. So in the London context, we don't like regeneration. We don't see the model of regeneration, we don't see any benefit at all. We just see it as destruction, as demolition of things that we value. So we don't use this term at all. For us, it's just development. And because over the last 10 years, there's been an increasing demolition program of the council estates in London, when a new mayor for London was elected 2 years ago, one of the main issues that we'd been lobbying the mayor on was that there must be a ballot, there must be a vote of the tenants living on an estate before their homes can be demolished. So this is the whole idea of something being done to people. Well, shouldn't the people, the citizens, actually have some choice in all of this? Whether they actually want to have a better home, inverted commas, whether the conditions are so bad where they live that they would actually see a benefit in actually having a rebuild, reprovision that they could move to. But in most cases, to give them the chance to say no. Please refurbish our homes, or please just go away because we don't want this where we live. So we lobbied for a ballot, and we succeeded. So the Mayor of London has now agreed in policy terms that no demolitions can go forward of the council housing without there being a ballot of the tenants who live on that estate. And now we are in and how do we implement it? Many practical questions here, but at least we have succeeded at the policy level in getting this commitment from the Mayor of London. And final page, just to give you some web links to different publications that we've produced, and also our web address. And you were very kind, because I'm sure I've done more than 30 minutes, but I'll stop there.
I have a bit of experience working with some civic initiative groups, and this is a unicorn. It's like, wow, fabulous. Let's do Just Space in Bucharest in every neighborhood. The big problem, there are many problems, and of course differences in culture and economic situation, but a big problem is keeping people engaged. So these are people with jobs, with thousands of other concerns, and how do you keep these people engaged on the long term? So you build a network, you say it's not an NGO, but what type of internal culture do you have? So what type of organizational or non-organizational structures do you have that prevent people from getting fatigued? Or when some get fatigued, others jump in. So how do you sustain this type of entity?
So don't forget that these are groups of citizens who come together themselves. So it's not someone else has encouraged them to form, and then someone else has to nurture them and look after them and ensure that they don't burn out, or, you know. So just to put that to one side. So this is a network of existing organizations who are doing many things and have been doing many things over a period of time. And the question is what they value in being a part of Just Space. I mean, this is a question which is the one I can best answer, because they're, as well as their participation in this citywide network, for none of them that is the only thing they do, and for most of them it's not the main thing they do. You know, the main thing is what they are doing in their original organization. And yours is a valid question there. Some organizations burn out, or people retire or die, and, you know, how do you pass on to the next generation? There's many issues, of course, but certainly in the London context, we are not short of passionate people seeing the formation of their own self-organized groups as being important. There's no, you know, historically, there's not been a problem there. People renew, you know. To answer quickly the Just Space side of things, obviously we've got to be seen to be giving something that's of value. We've got to have successes, you know. We've got to be meeting needs. So Just Space has evolved and evolved over the last 12 years. Now we're more active than we've ever been, and we have a much wider range of activity than at any point in our life so far. And I think that continuing renewal, adding to the activity, responding to the need, is what brings forward and maintains the life, really. So we're continually finding that new groups are coming to us, and they themselves bring ideas. They motivate those who've been in Just Space from the start. And I mean, to give you just an idea of the numbers, I think I mentioned to you that we had mapped 250 groups, and then we've got, over the last 2 years, we actually have double that number who've come to a Just Space event or activity over the last 2 years. So it's about 500, it's about double that number. So this is a lot of groups. And it would be a long answer to explain all the activities we do, but I think the essential point is around continually looking at what the need is and responding to it, about looking at the opportunities that are happening, given that our whole purpose is around the policy agenda in London. So there's always initiatives, of course, at the policy side, and then also always being creative, always being open to new ways of doing things, new issues to respond to. I think this is the best way to actually keep on renewing and keeping people being attracted and interested in what you do. I don't know if that answers, but okay.
Yeah, I have a question regarding this interaction between various communities, which obviously you engage with. My question is directed to the social capital that exists in these communities, because probably there are huge differences regarding social capital with the communities with which you engage. So is there a case where you would engage even though the community didn't itself recognize, identify the problem? So would you go into a community without them having the initiative, but you recognize, identify that this is an important thing? So would you shape or, let's say, form this interest of the community? Would you also influence in that regard? Or you just go, let's say, you just establish contact with communities which already have some sort of formed social capital? By this social capital, I mean that they have some kind of educational resources to recognize what is important to do inside. Because, for example, in the cases that we watch, there are huge differences about how people see the situation. Yeah. Is it clear enough? Yeah. Okay.
My experience doesn't see this as a problem, actually. I can't believe England is unique either. I don't believe in this idea of places being very unique and so on. So I think what I observe from my life experience must be quite general, and that is that a lot of people like to take part in things. They may not, our main business is around planning and the future of the city, but many people will be perhaps involved in food growing. They might have an allotment or food growing space. They might have children at a school, and they get involved to different degrees in what happens at that school where their child is at, and so on and so on. I mean, actually, I think it's part of being human to actually want to take part in things, to socialize, to interact. So I don't believe actually that there is some kind of capacity shortfall. This would be my feeling about what you said at an emotional level. To try and answer probably what you're getting at is, we have a group in London which is called the London Forum of Civic Amenity Societies, which was existing before Just Space, but is part of our network. And this was set up mainly for retired professionals who wanted to get together and do something in their neighbourhood. And we have many of these so-called amenity societies across London, which are, as I suggested, people with what would generally be seen as high social capital, who would, know how the system works quite well, perhaps, have relationships within institutions, and so on and so on. So we have this kind of body in London, as I'm sure everywhere has. But for us in Just Space, we are very consciously raising the question of justice. And we are very consciously from the start looking at inequality. And so we were very clear that we were not an amenity society. We were not a group of retired professionals and supporting that particular type of group in particular. But in London, there are, as I mentioned in my previous reply, there are very many citizens groups of all shapes and forms. The issue for us has been, how do we bring them together? And how do we interest people in their ability to be able to shape their city? Not just shape their school or shape their local health service, which many people are involved in, but to think, well, actually by getting together we can do more than that, because maybe at a strategic level we have to do more than that if we want a better school or a better health practice. So this is part of our way of looking at things, and I think just to quickly answer your other point, do we go out to actually form new groups or to consciously shape an area? No. But it happens, you know? You plant seeds and things grow. So I think it's more organic than you suggested, really. You want me to hurry up? It's a big question. I mean, I'm trying to do justice to the question.
6 months ago, when we were thinking of how to use this opportunity of the symposium, there was this idea of comparison between Western and Eastern Europe, and his question, together with Alex's question, come because there is a low level of involvement in societies that were under a totalitarian regime. So there is a difference. Thank you very much.